se mangiare, o proletari alla riscossa, mangiare rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfare, bandiera rossa deve trionfare, bandiera rossa deve trionfare, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Well, I'm chairing this evening's meeting of the Workers' International Network. I'd like to, welcome you all to the meeting. It's really good to see you all. This evening's meeting concerns the situation in Lebanon, in a country with a very corrupt and ineffective government. There have been a good 12 months worth of protests on the streets to try and get rid of them. And of course, this has all been exacerbated by COVID and by the explosion last week. We're very lucky we've got some from Lebanon at the meeting. And I'll now ask Roger Silverman if you'd like to introduce them.
Yes, I'd just like to say we're really lucky. We have an incredibly top level lineup for the meeting tonight. First, we've got Comrade Nadim Haidar. He is a researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies in Beirut. He holds an MA in Middle Eastern Studies and BA in Political Studies from the American University of Beirut. His thesis focused on Palestine. He's worked as an elementary, middle and high school teacher for more than 4 years, specifically committing himself to disadvantaged schools serving marginalized communities living in Lebanon. So he'll give us a direct first-hand report from this center of the revolution. We also we're very privileged to have Comrade Jade Saab, who is also with us. He's a Lebanese Canadian activist, currently based in Scotland, as he completes a PhD on ideology and the process of socialist revolution, which sounds like quite a good subject. He's edited a forthcoming collection on the 2019 uprisings in North Africa and West Asia, titled A Region in Revolt, which covers the revolutions in Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. So I'm looking forward to reading that book. Jade is also a regional organizer in Britain for the Industrial Workers of the World. So,
big welcome to our two.
Sorry, I forgot to say, we also have Comrade David Hemsen, who is well known to most of you here, who's also had a very rich revolutionary history based in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, and now based in the USA, and of course is a very prominent member of the Workers' International Network. So I think this makes for a very useful meeting tonight.
Thanks, Roger. I think we're very pleased to hear from these three speakers, and we welcome you to our meeting. Have you any idea how long you'd like to speak for? Nadim?
Oh, sorry. First of all, thank you a lot for the lovely introduction, Mr. Silverman. And I mean, as much as you'd like, I'm at your service.
Shall we say about 20 minutes and I'll warn you at 15 minutes? Would that be acceptable?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. What about Jade and David?
Yeah, I'm happy to follow up after Nadim, and I'm also happy for this to be a more interactive Q&A if you're okay with that. Once we've given a bit of a brief on the situation on the ground, then if there are any specific questions, we can answer that.
So you want to do a quick one after David, and then after Nadim, sorry, and then we'll go into your question. So what about you, David Hemsen?
Well, look, if I could have 20 minutes. I mean, look, I'm adjusting to the fact that we've got some marvelous speakers here. So maybe 25 minutes with a 15-minute warning and countdown, so I can make sure that there's enough time. I prepared some more on the background for myself and for others to, to consider, and some theoretical issues.
Right, that's about an hour's worth, isn't it? Leaving us an hour for discussion. So I'm just thinking maybe if we go with Nadim first, then David, then Jade, that can lead into the question and answer. Would that be all right with you, Jade? Yeah, yeah. Okay, right. Nadim, would you like to begin? Thank you.
Sure, I would love to, but I just would like to know exactly what the question is or what we'd like me to talk about, because I haven't been given any anything.
Roger.
Well, could I ask if I could come in? I hate to do this. It's not because of my ego size. I hope it's narrowing very quickly as I see the formidable people we've got here. But I've tried to pose a series of questions, and maybe it'd be useful for me to throw the ball into play, and then for the others to score a couple of goals.
Are the two speakers happy with that? Yeah, okay.
If that's okay.
Yeah. All right, go on then, David.
All right. Well, look, with apologies, but here we go. Look, our organization and workers internationally are facing a challenge of revolution, and that we find that in many countries, usually small and developing countries like Lebanon, Zimbabwe, Chile, Algeria, Sudan, and now as we see in Belarus, we find that there are democratic revolutions which can transition to socialist conclusions, but they face an utterly ruthless and corrupt ruling elite, which uses force and every trick in the book to stay in power. And astonishingly, these ruling elites, the national bourgeois, usually have the support of the international powers, from Trump to Putin, and now we see in this case from Iran and even Israel. So there's unity at an international level to ensure the existence of an existing power, and the workers' movement and the democratic movement and the civic movement, which it has various characteristics, face this, these challenges, and often alone. In Lebanon, I imagine, but also in Zimbabwe, we hear workers going into prison, being beaten, coming out again, and appealing to the world, for help. And there's no help from within the region and internationally, because apart from the working movement, and there's other people in struggle at the moment. Now, I won't go into the history of the national divisions of the region, but I just want to touch on some aspects of uneven development and combined development. We're seeing certain common factors, and when we look at these countries in struggle. We see ethnic divisions which are woven into the political fabric of rule. We have relatively small or devastated working classes. If you think about Lebanon now, and certainly Zimbabwe in the past, at one time the working class was of some considerable size, with the devastation of economic crisis over a long period. They have been reduced and sometimes fragmented politically. Rural people face despotic traditional despotism throughout Africa, and I imagine also throughout the Middle East. The cities can struggle to a certain extent to break free, but face, the almost invincible or apparently invincible rule of force, which is used quite shamelessly. And the people of these countries are ruled through a national bourgeois, which is utterly dependent on the state and on loans and a grant from existing powers of all persuasions. The national bourgeoisie is incapable of advancing the nation, to solve the democratic issues, or even to unite the nation, or to advance it economically in any consistent manner, although there can be short stops and starts. And as long as they do not contest the US domain in the region, these elites carry on almost, ad infinitum. In Zimbabwe, we've seen 40 years of rule. In Lebanon, we've seen a ruling elite coming into power in the 1943, and more in its constitution then, more or less the same as now. I mean, Lebanon, if I dare say, with greater authorities present, was a fragment of Syria. It attained independence in 1943 under rather unusual circumstances with Vichy France. And, you know, there was a kind of ramshackle assembly of different components around the constitution of the Christian ruling elite, which had the support of France. At that time, the Christian population had 51% of representation, or quite a small population. It's now, you know, shrunk to about 34% in the current period. But we do see that Muslims are now in the majority, with Shia about a third, Sunni about a third, and then a very wide range of other faiths. And so Lebanon's history has been marked by alternating periods of short-term political stability and on longer-term turmoil interspersed with bursts of prosperity on Beirut's position as a trading center, and then for followed by long periods of war. In the constitution, or let's say the population, the demographics of Lebanon has to be interwoven, or considered to be interwoven, the fate of the Palestinian people, and many interventions from Israel. I won't go into all of the details of that. Now, when each of the struggles in Lebanon has faced a national bourgeoisie, I mentioned it was constituted, first of all, in 1943 on the basis of an algebraic formula of rule by the Christians, by elements of the Druze, by the Muslim leaders of the time. And that is not formally stated in the constitution then, but it's been the most durable element in terms of the ruling strata in the area. And we see it in a way, and this is the confusion often of people who look at former colonial countries, is it doesn't seem to be particularly powerful, and it doesn't seem to be particularly more oppressive than imperialist intervention. But it exists as a kind of algae floating on the surface of the water. It looks green, but actually it's a toxic blue. It eliminates oxygen within the water, killing off democratic aspirations and killing the fish, you know, in the water. And we've seen that in Lebanon, we have a continuous, even though there's been continuous change, they've been hanging on and even tightening their grip on the state, even through catastrophes and disasters, and that each of the sectarian sections covers the back of the other. In reality, it's been described as a mafia determined to maintain its rule by buying out elements, killing those competitors that remain, and eliminating dissidents. So this is one of the permanent factors of the ruling elite in Algeria and Sudan and Lebanon, and dare we say it now in South Africa, is this ruling elite, which certainly is not wanting to go anywhere. The motto of the people, I watched a movie last night on Lebanon, and this was repeated a few times in the family movie. It is better the devil you know. In other words, you know it's all wrong, but at least it's our man. It's our FOB, it's our SOB, as the Americans would say, it's the devil. But the devil, you know, is still the devil. But they can't treat language. I'll give you a quote. Corruption in Lebanon is bigger than the state itself. It is a very thick and thorny wall which separates us from change. A wall fortified by a class which is resorting to all dirty tricks in order to resist and to preserve its gain. They know that we pose a threat to them and that the success of this government means a change in the long ruling class whose corruption has asphyxiated the country. I won't say who said that right till the end, because it would give away the game that the national bourgeoisie plays. The game is that each strata supports the other, even though you'd imagine that, for instance, Hezbollah would be firmly opposed to the corruption of Christian politicians. In fact, there's a reciprocal relationship which allows Hezbollah to be a state within the state, to control access to the ports, and to at times, and to be able to bring in its own imports and the like, and to have to be an armed militia while there's also a national army, a certain privileged layer there. Now, when we look at the ruling strata, we see that actually there have been challenges without end. I just want to move on very quickly now to the October Revolution. That is October 2019. An extraordinary movement which thrilled us all, of a movement from the streets based on the youth intelligentsia, working people, synchronizing with movements which are appearing in Iraq, Iran, and even stirrings in Egypt. An astonishing development which would have changed the character of the whole region. And the social conditions were an absolute decline in services, familiar to those in South Africa, where garbage is lying in the streets untreated, although you're paying for the service, and the like, of corruption at local government and every other level as well. There was an extraordinary potential, and the ruling strata then were forced to resign, and then with some illusions, maybe at that time, a government was set up to actually to bring in a new form of rule. And it was meant to be a technocratic regime, which would actually be a change from the past. But there is nothing which is technical about leadership. And it turned out that the leadership was absolutely integrated with the existing ruling strata. Now I want to move on quickly to the question of the post-COVID period, or the COVID period now, the devastation which took place with the explosion of 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate in the port of Beirut, which devastated and killed and left something like 300,000 homeless. We've seen throughout the, I just want to touch on what had characterized the period up till then. We'd seen that the currency, at least the earnings of people, I heard an interview with a professor at Beirut University who said that she was now earning something like 10% of what she'd earned the previous year before. In other words, there's been devastation in terms of the incomes of working people. And this all arose because of the tricks which the ruling elite had undertaken, which had eliminated capital controls for themselves, but actually imposed them on other people. If you know anything of Zimbabwean history or current situation, this is exactly how, what has taken place with the ruling elite there. So that you can get, the ruling elite can access dollars, but not ordinary people. Capital controls have been put in place, but have not actually been operational. And you've seen that now debt servicing consumes something like 30% of the budget. And in court cases, it's been found that the money that Hezbollah has been accessing has actually been drawn from from the budget and through all kinds of interlinking banking relations, so that they could transfer money through from Lebanon through to the intervention in Iraq. So everybody has had a finger in the pie, some to a greater extent than others. After the devastation, on the 4th of August, we've had the spectacle of Macron turning up in Beirut, making a guest appearance, a disgusting performance, and attracting some applause, because in the disaster of the local ruling strata, the former imperialist power, at least seemed to have some authority. But what an appearance, strutting around Beirut when he couldn't do the same in Paris. And we've now seen the danger, in the sense that the ruling elite cannot continue in the old way, but without a decisive intervention from below and a coherent intervention, it looks as though they are seeking out ways in which they can continue the rule. Just imagine this. The land around the port has been devastated. There are already reports of land agents and the banks getting busy, and the local elite, of course, getting busy to buy up this land and then to cash in on the amount, on the disaster funding, which they're anticipating from the World Bank, the IMF, from France and the US and everywhere else. In other words, from being rich, they could become super rich, you know, from the corruption that would result from this intervention. While the working people are forced into the most horrifying destitution. Now, how can how can such an issue be resolved? Every day we can see the youth, and particularly, you know, prepared to get into the streets, even though the first activity of the soldiers and the police is to spread so much gas around, tear gas around, that it's almost impossible, you know, for the demonstrations to take place in terms of the physical situation. People have to breathe in tear gas to be able to assemble. So we see a movement which is absolutely magnificent, which is prepared to sacrifice time and again, which stands against the odds of the local ruling elite and the international ruling elite, which is united to hold the existing elite in place. I'm not sure expressly whether Israel actually supports this, but it seems that every single ruling strata around in the region and beyond actually wants to keep this regime in place. You see that the challenge from the people in struggle is to know how to be able to displace an utterly corrupt, incompetent, long-ruling strata and deadly mismanagement, and to change their conditions. And the answer has to be that it's only possible by the working class and struggling people, because it's more, the working class in a sense has been devastated, and we have to look to the youth and to other strata as well to be involved in these struggles. Through that unity, through unity and struggle, to be able to spread the ideas and the marvelous aspirations of the Lebanese strugglers into Iran, into Iraq, into Syria, and into Egypt, and internationally, so that the struggle in one country can succeed by the spreading of the struggle throughout regions and throughout the world. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think that's a really excellent introductory background to the, the question of what's going on Lebanon at the moment. I think very, very valuable. So Nadim, I think we're expecting you to tell us what life's like on the ground, aren't we? I think that's the question. Is that all right?
I mean, sure. I'd also like to just, make a kind of a scattershot response to many of the points Mr. David made. But if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
So no, I mean, thanks, David. It was a pretty good introduction, more or less sums up the crisis and of course the predicament in which we're in. But I'd like to just kind of respond to a few of the points you made, just as a maybe open discussion and maybe to clarify. First you started the discussion with opening that, we're in a crisis of a revolution. And this is something we've been hearing a lot here in Lebanon, that there's a revolution in Algeria, the revolution in Sudan. I would urge us to kind of reconsider, just at least in terms of terminology, the use of the term revolution. I think is a bit too quick to, I feel like people should be using words like uprisings and rebellions and revolts precisely because there isn't a revolution. The word revolution, to me, entails a much more fundamental reorganization of structural relations. And in all the places many of the places you mentioned, this hasn't taken place. And if anything, I would say there's a revolutionary process in Lebanon that might be exploited and hopefully turned into a revolution, but we're definitely not at that stage yet, neither here or many other places, I would say. But just as a kind of interesting debate that many people here have is that they use the term revolution, but I feel that by using the term revolution on these kind of events that we're kind of diluting its meaning. But that's just one point. Concerning what you were mentioning, I mean, yes, the left is fragmented, and that's a big problem globally. It's definitely a problem here as well. I'm not even sure if we can even call it a left as such. It's so fragmented. And as such, when these kind of when there's a kind of over-determination of forces that lead to a kind of rebellion or a revolt, the sad part, I think, in the story of the left globally, and Lebanon is just a microcosm, you can see as such, is that the left is always unable or not ready to exploit that moment, to drive it in a certain way, to direct it in a certain place. And we're not even ready to confront the counter-revolution or the enemies at hand. In Lebanon, this is extremely relevant. The left, as someone once said, has a very good time of occupying space, but not such a good time of maintaining it. Because we don't have these parties or these coalitions that have clear programs, clear visions, clear directives, it becomes much, and then over time it peters out, and the counter-revolution has more than enough time and resources to set in, fragment, and kind of put out the fires, if you wish. In Lebanon, unlike what you said, the elites actually are cracking. That's something that's really new after the explosion. The elite forces that make up the ruling class are beginning to crack. They are turning on each other, they're pointing fingers, they're getting really, there's just a lot of signs that the elite is not as cohesive as it used to be for the longest time now. However, and this gives hope that if we do have a genuine leftist coalition that can form itself in the near future, then we can maybe make a few penetrations and take hold of the state in a much more effective way. The only problem here, and this is where the real counter-revolution comes in, is the question of Hezbollah. The question of Hezbollah, I was just talking to Jade earlier, but is kind of, it's a different creature. You know, it's not just another mafia. It's not just another bourgeoisie, local bourgeoisie, turned businessman, turned politician, turned, warlord. But it's a geopolitical force with so much more resources and so much more cohesion and so much more just international support. And and the way I see it going forward is that the challenge for the left now is how to chart a path going forward, how to chart a path that deals with the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon, because my realistic tendencies don't see that Hezbollah is going away anytime soon. But just to say that the other elites that have been backed up by other powers, they seem to be much more fragile than they've ever been. And there is a genuine hope that they might start, not to say collapse in like a big bang, but they will start petering out, and their relevance and their importance in the political landscape will slowly start to recede, which I think is an very important historical moment to capture. I, however, don't see that the left I don't see that whatever left there is, or other independent forces or progressive forces, I don't see that they're organized enough or ready enough to make such a move. In the war of maneuver, I feel like basically we're losing. And Hezbollah and its allies are very much now in the midst of assorting themselves and starting a very strong counter-revolutionary narrative and wave. And that's the struggle I think that many of us have here as a Lebanese left, especially when we talk to international leftists. Actually, this is a theme that keeps coming up, is that many international leftists very much glorify the presence of Hezbollah and see them as an anti-imperialist force and so on. And also that causes kind of a problem because in their later years, they've become a much more counter-revolutionary force, at least speaking from a leftist position, from a class-based position. On the point that you made concerning corruption, and it's a funny, I like that you brought up that quote. I'm well aware of who it is, but this is also a narrative that I very much despise, is that the elite always hide behind this game of bad apples of, oh, it's just some corruption, and if we take out the corruption and the mismanagement of things, somehow we're going to become a good development state and so on. And that's just not, I mean, every state is corrupt. Corruption is not something particular to Lebanon. Capitalism is the breeding soil of corruption. And so to say corruption just kind of begs the question, and doesn't really hit on the source of the problem. And too often it's like the easy way out, just to say mismanagement of resources, corruption, and that's why Lebanon is what it is. Whereas rather it's a much more complex story of the Lebanese state and economy going all the way back to the days of the French Mandate in 1920, because ever since then, more or less, I mean, not to simplify too much, but Lebanon's development as a political economy has been completely dependent on the imperial center, so to speak. The French saw Lebanon as a kind of bridgehead into the region, used it to capture certain markets and as a gateway to the Syrian markets, effectively, as the Ottoman Empire was falling. They very much introduced and reinforced a very rentier economy. And what I mean by that is a non-productive economy, an economy that focuses on banking and trade, and not even trade, sorry, just some kind of merchant capital, but mostly it's banking and today real estate and service sector. So we don't have a productive economy in any way or form. When you combine that with the state system or the state building project that happened in Lebanon, which, as you mentioned, David, like, of course, there's a sectarian element to it, but it's just the surface kind of facade or tool or ploy that the local bourgeoisie uses to divide the working class and to force the working class to have to, clientelism, to force them to have to claim loyalty to certain patrons, to obtain certain services and welfare from the state, given that these same people, these same local elites have captured the state effectively. So it's this rentier economy combined with geopolitical forces and as you said, uneven and combined development is a great way to understand this. What Mehdi Amil, a local Marxist, I think one of the best Marxist thinkers in the Arab region, called a colonial mode of production. You have this colonial mode of production here that takes the sectarian element and completely morphs it into its own kind of capitalist formation. And all that has led to a complete crisis in the end, because we don't have, our debt is so high that we're the third most indebted country in the world now. Our trade deficit is insanely high because we import almost all of our goods as a result of this rentier kind of economy that has been built and sustained since the 1920s, you could say, and has continued. The Civil War, and this is where I'd like to just take it back a bit from the sectarian narrative, because too often when we want to understand Lebanon, people use sectarianism as a mode of analysis. And I think, of course, yes, on a certain level, of course, yes, there's some kind of sectarian color, but really it's just class war. I mean, really it's just simple. It's a class war. It's a geopolitical, by extension, a geopolitical class war as well, that the Civil War marked a kind of crisis, because right before the Civil War, costs of living had been doubling and there was so many socioeconomic crises. Workers' struggles were really becoming stronger. The Civil War was a way to just shut that all down and defeat the workers' struggle. And after 1990, when the Civil War ended, essentially a continuation of what was before it. Just more banking, more real estate, just a completely non-productive economy, very heavily reliant on cheap foreign labor that's extremely super exploited. And over time, all this led to extremely unbearable scenario. Now we have unemployment rates that are like 40%. Youth unemployment rate is up to 40%. 50% of Lebanese now are living in poverty. Lebanese, not to say anything of the Syrian and refugee and the Palestinian refugees and other foreign workers who are even in more desperate situations. Our debt is so high that half of government revenues each year have to go just paying the interest of the debts, just the interest on the debts that they've accrued over the years because of this Ponzi scheme between the banks loaning to the governments at low interest rates and so on. It's another story, but that's the story I would like to focus on. The more class story, the defeat of the class struggle in the Civil War, and now finally, after all this overdetermination of crises, a crisis of the care regime, a crisis of reproductive labor, a crisis of the currency devaluation, COVID-19, and now this bomb, we might have, and of course with the uprising that happened in October, then this is the chance for the left to hopefully take advantage of all this again. It's just a moment in this war of maneuver. We haven't been as strong as now for a long time. And maybe there's some hope there that we can start forming coalitions, working with the unions who have shown to be promising actually. And in time, it's a long battle, but in time form a certain coalition that might take back the state. And as I said before, the next struggle becomes an issue of how the left deals with Hezbollah, what kind of arrangements, what kind of coexistence can they accept? And if not coexistence, then it's going to be a full-on battle. And if that happens, well, we're going to lose because we're in no position to win such a confrontation. As for the Macron comment, I mean, thanks for saying that. It was nice of you to say. Yes, Macron was a pretty embarrassing and shameful presence. And I would say I can only understand that using kind of a Lacanian analysis and trying to say that it was a kind of like re-emergence of a new master signifier that, brings some kind of cohesion to the chaos, but it's a silly ploy and everyone can read through it. I think now at this point I'm almost done. I just wanted to make all these small interventions and just to say that the real challenge now for the Lebanese left is, as I said, just how do we deal with this very, very strong, organized political force, the Hezbollah, I mean, and because that's really a challenge that I don't know I have no real value in. And I remember when I was in the streets and when they showed up and started beating up the protesters, I remember the sense of helplessness I got, that, wow, this is a really uphill battle. I don't know how we're going to dislodge them from their very strong position. In more or less the entire deep state is controlled by them. And that's a challenge going forward. And it's daunting what to say, but I hope that was in some attempt to give you my response to the many interventions you made. And as for the situation now as it is, we've had some protests last week. They were great because they lifted the ceiling, so to speak. They made a bit more bold moves, a bit more vandalism, a bit more aggressive, more willing to use violence in a certain way, which I think is a good thing. I think we need to raise the bar in our tactics and just to embolden the people. But at the same time, the state just released a state of emergency, which completely gives the army almost complete, if not complete, powers to do anything they want. So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly is gone. They can literally barge into your house now for whatever reason, at any small suspicion. And that's very much scary. So there's a bit of a lull right now. But the street pressure is never going to end. It's just never going to end. This is going to keep happening. It's going to be this new form of politics of contestation, and it's good. It's just that I don't see a left that's able to channel that energy or direct it in a really hopeful or positive way yet. I do have hope, though, that in the coming years, some kind of leftist coalition might form a significant player in the political landscape. And that's all from me. Thanks.
That's absolutely brilliant, Nadim. I'm sure that's given us quite a comprehensive insight into the situation in Beirut. Thank you very much. I'm sure lots of comrades will want to ask you questions. I'm just thinking maybe, Jade, you might want to say a few words first, and then we can throw it open to everybody else. Can I just say, comrades, if you wanted to start putting your hands up, if you could just use the hand in the participant box, that will make sure I don't miss you that you want to speak. Thanks. Okay, Jade.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's not much to follow on from that. Very comprehensive. Thank you, David, for also putting together that kind of initial presentation. I guess the two kind of topics I want to touch on is this concept of the state, and then maybe also touch on the development of the movement up until now, because I think in Western media especially, there tends to be this kind of fetishism towards spontaneity, but there has been a progression in this movement and the way it's built up to what it has become now, as well as dynamics that are currently happening that alter the way the movement looks like. I also wanted to agree with Nadim about this use of the term revolution, and the way I look at it is there are revolutionary situations, and then there are revolutionary outcomes. So I'd say we're definitely in a revolutionary situation. Some people might argue even that's a bit of a, too much of a positive statement, because we don't have a presence or an ability to directly contest power in even protests in the street. We can't deal with it as if it's an unlimited kind of store of energy, especially with the levels of repression that we're seeing now with this military kind of law. I mean, essentially, Lebanon has now become a police state. I think any kind of talk of it being a democracy, the government has resigned. There's sweeping military powers, and on top of that, you have direct threats coming from Hezbollah, who pretty much issued a statement, a readiness of mobilization for their supporters. So we are in a very, very tense situation right now after the explosives. But anyway, I'm going to roll it back a bit. When it comes to the formation of the Lebanese state, there was a big influence from colonial powers, but I think it's important to note the role of local bourgeois power as well. There was no reason for, once Lebanon coming out of independence, for it to be a sectarian state. And funnily enough, during the mandate period, during colonialism, there was a plan for Lebanon to become a secular and modern state. It was through the path of independence that the Lebanese bourgeois, through their national pact, which is kind of this gentleman's agreement that divides the seats of power in parliament, etc., that reinforced this kind of method of dividing power, which actually can be traced back all the way to Ottoman times. So I think it's important for us to understand the role of the Lebanese bourgeoisie themselves in creating this path that will allow them to benefit from whatever basic infrastructure French colonialism has put in place for resource extraction to turn it to their own benefit. So that is very important. And the reason I bring that up is because, as Nadim has said, there is this kind of, I call it the myth of the strong state. A lot of people in Lebanon say, well, in Lebanon we have a weak state, but that's not the function of the state. We know it from a class perspective. The function of the state is to allow and legitimize the extraction of resources, of profit, and this is the form of the state in Lebanon. So when we're talking about a revolution or an uprising, we're not talking about a simple changing someone at the top or a few players at the top. It is a fundamental change. And this is a big struggle that the movement so far has not been able to cope with or come to terms with. In October, when the protests started taking place, the demands kind of coalesced again around four key demands. and they were the resignation of the government, the formation of a independent technocratic government, which of course is something that cannot exist, the creation of a new secular electoral law, and then holding new and early elections. But then the process in which they were seeking all those things were through the government. So essentially they were asking the government, they were asking all of these players, this ruling class, to act as their own executioners, which isn't going to happen. So we are looking at a very long process here of building grassroots class power through the unions, through these protests, through local councils or committees, to wage this war over the long term. We've seen this last government now resign. All of us knew it was just a kind of a front to save face, and the lesson that they're trying to teach the people is we as the ruling class, we're your only hope. There is no other alternative. No one else can take care of you like we can. Which is, of course, something that everyone has woken up that, you know, they're not taking care of us, especially with this last explosion. You know, I say they've moved from a stage of slow violence to hard and quick violence. You're talking about a death toll of, I think it surpassed 170 now, and the devastation is, you know, absolutely, it's just catastrophic. And as Nadim said, as a country that lives on imports, the destruction of the port that used to process most of our imports is going to have a catastrophic economic impact. So yeah, we are in a very long revolutionary arc, I'd call it, and the hope is that the small and fragmented left movements, left parties, left, you know, and the union movements can forge some kind of coalition, some kind of agreement, some kind of more material kind of understanding of the future, or presentation of what the steps are. I think that we still suffer from a bit of this liberal notion of, oh, we'll just have early elections and it'll be fine. But you know, when the ruling class decides on the electoral law, when they're fully capable of bribing and activating their network, their clientelist network, elections under the current circumstances is not the way it's going to happen. So Lebanon is in a unique position where it's not going through a process of democratization as is other countries in North Africa, for example, let's say Sudan, Algeria, etc., that you already have this faux image of democracy. And, you know, speaking of Macron visiting, I mean, Macron could have pulled his support anytime since October. He doesn't want to because most of Lebanese debt is owned by France. So, you know, they have vested interests in maintaining the ruling class and in just securing their investment in purely, you know, economic terms. So it was, you know, just a farce, but it is also unfortunate that you still have people in Lebanon who have this kind of, I don't know if the right term would be this self-orientalist view of seeing themselves as wanting to be colonized again and being civilized by the French savior. So you got a lot of those kind of floating around in social media. Thankfully, they're not a serious current within the dynamics, but it is sad that you still have to deal with this kind of rhetoric. Yeah, and then the other thing I want to discuss, I'll go through it very quickly. David mentioned the garbage crisis in Lebanon, which was in 2015, and that's kind of where you really started to see a coalescence of this street movement. You had building occupations then, calls for resignation. So this movement really needs to be traced back to 2015 and before, of course. And there is this move of it becoming more radical, also because there is a mode of proletarization of the people because of the dire economic situations. Back then it was bad, but it really manifested itself through this garbage crisis. So it was a different kind of movement, but it was really one of the first kind of street movements you can see. And then from that, it passed through kind of an electoral movement, and now it is becoming this just more class conscious, I'd say. So there has been a development there as well over the years, which I can only hope continues to develop in that direction.
Mute yourself. Yeah, thanks, Jade. Again, that was another really excellent and comprehensive overview of what's happening out in Lebanon, and you've shared some perspectives that you have with us as well, which is really useful. So thanks for that. I'll now throw the meeting open to questions and contributions, and then hopefully we'll by about 22 quarters to now we can just come back so the three speakers can sum up if they want to. So I don't see any hands up at the moment, so we are awed into silence. Thin. Okay, I can see you. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Finn, you need to unmute yourself. Can't hear you.
Yeah, they're excellent opening contributions. So I want to direct a question to on this issue of the Constitution. To what extent is the Constitution an obstacle in the growth of the left-wing movement? See, when the French had the mandate over Lebanon, as was illustrated here, they created conditions. There was a Constitution 26 and again the National Pact in 43, created conditions where the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the Prime Minister of the Assembly has to be a Sunni, the Speaker has to be a Shiite, things of that nature. And then the government departments, civil service jobs, and other jobs are distributed on the basis of religious and sectarian affiliation, where the loyalty is often to the religion rather than to the state. And I wonder to what extent is that an obstacle? Now, this isn't an accident. This French tactic in the post-Ottoman Empire period was also used in Cyprus. When the British pulled out of Cyprus and created a constitution in 1960, their main opponent then was the Greek Eosis and Grivas and people of that nature, where the constitution was such where the president had to be a Greek and the vice president had to be a Turk, creating an institution of sectarianism. By the way, it also happened in the north of Ireland, where the present constitutional situation in the north is the first minister has to be a nationalist or a unionist, and the deputy first minister has to be the other one. And the distribution of departmental positions and ministerial positions is not based on a vote in Parliament, but it's a thing called the hunt mechanism, where the various parties, many of which are sectarian-based, get their chance to have a bite of the cherry. Now, that kind of religious constitution is not unique to Lebanon, but it does allow for corruption, clientelism, things of that nature. So the question really is, to what extent does that kind of division in society create an obstacle for the growth of the left? And just one final point. I came across recently a reference to, in 1963, there was a Communist Party majority in the port of Tripoli area in the north of Lebanon. Now, I presume it's the case, but I'm interested to hear a bit more about that. The Communist Party at one point must have been influential. Now, that was a port area and it was like to have members, but can anybody shed light on that? This was 1963, where the Communist Party had a strong influence in the port of Tripoli area.
Thanks for that, Finn. There's no other hands up at the moment. Does one of the other speakers want to respond to that? Or should we ask some more questions first? But nobody's. There are some questions in the comments as well. I don't know whether the speakers can see those. Right, Dave.
Yes, I was interested in the point that was made by Nadim, I think, that said that unions have shown some promising signs. Well, I think from the left, the socialists, what the unions are or are not doing is an extremely important point. So could you say a bit more about any movement by unions in terms of class struggle? Because my experience is they cut across a lot of these divisions when you have people in work areas composed of different religions and backgrounds. That's has great prospects for uniting people across the religions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, there's some questions in the chat. Can we have more information on the unions? And also, somebody's asking about the impact of the destruction of the port on the surrounding workplaces. So, perhaps one of our speakers would answer that. Any more questions, anyone? Nadim, do you want to answer some of that?
Yeah, definitely. For the union question, okay, so the unions before the Civil War, before 75, the unions were much stronger, and they actually were a very powerful force in the class struggle. They were more or less defeated in the Civil War, and then post-Civil War, they had very much been co-opted and busted, just like many other places in the world. It's nothing not particular to us. For the longest time, people had given up on the unions because they had been so co-opted, and not only that, actually, many unions were quite regressive even. For example, just recently, with the way, for example, Palestinian rights in Lebanon to employment works. Recently, in 2010, there was an amendment to help Palestinians access the labor market more fairly. Yet, even though there was a change in the labor law, many Palestinians couldn't access certain labor because of the unions. The unions in Lebanon would deny them access to their trade. So the unions in the past have also kind of played even negative roles, but lately there have been some really good I would say interventions or moves that have reclaimed some unions. And the example I gave recently is the lawyers' union. The lawyers' union and the teachers' union also had a very big role. Just some 5-6 years ago, teachers' union tried to do some things, but they were also eventually defeated. And more recently, in the post-uprising, the lawyers' union has been more or less captured, let's say, by progressive voices. And they've been making efforts to help the activists and launch a certain kind of solidarity movement. But the question of unions and how to understand unions as a leftist has also been quite a debate here. Some socialists are of the opinion that unions, although shape a certain potential to organize workers, nonetheless, due to the structure of unions, the way they work, since they're restricted to certain trades, some people might say that no, they develop a kind of narrow interest in maintaining their own kind of more communal interest, and they don't really necessarily expand to other, let's say, non-workers or more marginalized communities or students and so on. So they might be too focused on a certain kind of practice. I'm of the kind that says, I definitely think unions are a very important node that the left should definitely mobilize. And we have some success in the lawyers' union now, and many activists are now kind of thinking that since there are no real radical parties around, the Communist Party has been very much discredited. They have a youth section that's now kind of gaining some momentum, but they're still very much in their nascent stage. Some people are arguing that maybe the only hope we have are the unions because they do represent an alternative organized coalition that might kind of chart the way forward. As for the question on the Constitution, yeah, of course it does affect. Of course it affects class struggle because of kind of what you said. It reinforces clientelism. So effectively, it divides the working class, both discursively and materially, and also creates a relation of dependency in as much as the more poor working class are forced to reckon with these quote-unquote sectarian parties in order to access certain welfare, certain services. So for example, what Jade was saying concerning the garbage crisis movement, what many analysts say that the reason why that failed is that although it cut across sectarian lines, it was nonetheless ultimately an urban middle class movement. As such, these kind of subjects, these political subjects, they're not dependent on the patron-client networks. They have enough resources to kind of chart their own trajectory. They usually have a certain level of education, a certain level of cultural capital, and so on, that they don't actually need to depend on the party to access hospitalization, to access education, and so on. So by only focusing on the sectarian kind of, we're trying to reach out to all these sects, but not actually understanding sectarianism as not just a discursive tool, but a very material structure of dependency. And so if you want to challenge sectarianism, you don't just challenge it by going on the street and claiming a new kind of we. It's not a discursive matter. It's a matter of you need to be able to provide services, material services, so that the working class doesn't need these kind of structural relations. So it's definitely the Constitution, in as much as the Constitution just represents a symbolic articulation of these very material and very embedded material relations, then yes, it definitely gets in the way. So, but that's my answer.
Thanks, Nadim. I don't see any of the hands up again at the moment. I'm just double checking. I've just noticed in the comment that actually David Hemsen has referred to. He says, please consider the effects across the real region. Will we see uprisings in Iraq, Syria, and Iran again? I presume David's not just about to answer his own question, although he can if he wants. What about the other two speakers? Would you be able to comment on that?
If it's all right, I can come in a bit on this question and some of the previous ones. So yeah, to start with the effects in the region, I think it's important to understand, to note that even though it's not getting any kind of media coverage, these movements are still ongoing. None of them have ever gone away. So in Iran currently, you have a lot of strikes going on, especially in the oil regions, and usually that's an indicator of bigger things to come. In Iraq, it was either today or yesterday where students were protesting in the streets for their exam results, for not wanting to set their exams because of COVID, and fighting for a proper way, to get better results. And the student movement has always been a big one in Iraq. And then in Syria, the protests continue, even though, if you want to speak of the revolution or of what became a civil war has been largely suppressed, and now we are looking at, the counter-revolution securing its power, protests are still going. So it's important to note that, they never really went anywhere. Having said that, and this is all very promising, because of the history of the region, you do not have this level of cross-border solidarity. There is a lack of historical solidarity and understanding. I mean, even if you want to talk about Lebanon, to give you an example, ever since the end of the Civil War, Lebanon doesn't even have a unified history module to be taught in schools, because no one can agree on how they want to teach the history of the Civil War. So in Lebanon, we don't even know our own history, let alone, to understand the working class history of countries that are around us. Apart from solidarity with the Palestinians, which in and of itself has become a highly politicized tool used by mostly counter-revolutionary and authoritarian actors to suppress, movements, popular workers' movements. There's not a lot of knowledge outside of that. So it is an area, just a small plug here. I'm also a member of an alliance of Middle Eastern socialists, and this is what kind of we try and work on in building this solidarity. On the issue of union struggles, just to kind of add to what Nadim has already said, not only have there been gains in traditional unions, but there have also been the creation of independent alternative unions. I think one of the most known or the most active has been the Union for Journalists. So it's kind of an alternative union for journalists there. And yeah, similarly, historically, what Nadim said is, before the Civil War, before 1975, there was a large union struggle, and parts of this history that is forgotten in Lebanon. When we talk about the 50s as the golden age of Lebanon, there's a complete history that's being forgotten of labor struggles, of worker struggles, that include one of the biggest achievements was the establishment of our national university, the Lebanese University, happened during that time. And it's completely forgotten. The 50s is just seen in this kind of romantic, nostalgic, you know, we were a free market economy where everyone was rich and happy, and, you know, we had trams and trains, and a very romanticized lens, and that labor history is forgotten there. So yeah, there definitely is hope there. Finally, to go back to the question about the Constitution, I mean, it's funny to say, you know, does the Constitution impact? Because that, in a way, assumes that the ruling class rules through the Constitution, and the ruling class rules because it's a ruling class, not because there's a Constitution. And they've been, you know, since the end of the Civil War and before, have done things that are blatantly against the Constitution, including the Parliament extending for itself 3 times over, what was it, 3 or 4 years. So you know, there is no kind of legalistic, you know, even when you talk about the separation of powers in the Constitution, that just completely doesn't exist in Lebanon. You are talking about a ruling class in its purest sense, with you know, the smallest of fig leaves to masquerade it as something that it isn't. And then, yeah, so there was also a brief question about the Communist Party, the Lebanese Communist Party. So its strength needs to be understood in the strength of the labor union before, and the labor movement before the Civil War. But ever since its participation in the Civil War, which quickly degenerated into a sectarian war, and their continued participation in that, and a lot of their recent political decisions around, for example, their political position on what's happening in Syria, has left them largely discredited, even with many members of the left in Lebanon. And in the last elections, for example, they did not win a single seat in parliament. So their power has tremendously kind of just dwindled to be nice.
Thanks, Jade. Just having a look to see if there are any hands up. Jimmy.
Comrades, I wanted to ask a question about the United Nations military presence. I'm in a situation here where I'm aware, on an anecdotal basis, of Irish people who have been involved. In fact, I could near say at this stage, there's a couple of 100,000 Irish men over the last 42 years have educated and fed their families as a result of the United Nations service in the Lebanon. One of the things that has come through from talking with individuals is they seem to have developed a sympathy with the Lebanese as opposed to the Israelis or the Syrians. But even at that, there's a division in attitude that they would tend to support organizations or individuals other than the so-called Christian militias. But the question that runs through my mind is, according to the CIA fact book, the mandate of the Irish, or of the Irish, Indian, Nigerian, whoever they are, the United Nations presence, is to support the Lebanese army, the state army. Now, the question that runs up with that is, if the Lebanese state was under challenge from within, the army being a form of defense, if the army was to there's a number of permutations. The army could shatter, the army could back off, or the army could become a repressive instrument. I'm not sure which way it would go, and perhaps you, comrades, could give advice on how strong the army is in the pocket of the state leaders. But the question that I would ask is, what would the general attitude be of the Lebanese working class, and particularly the left-conscious working class, to the United Nations Army? Would they still see the army, or would they acknowledge the army as a beneficial role, or would they feel that they're there as a deterrent, a second 11 against a collapse of the army, or as a buffer between there and the Israeli state, or as a buffer against Hezbollah? I mean, there's a whole heap of questions as regards to the role of that army, but the central one is, what would the general attitude of the Lebanese working class be to supporting the presence of that army or the removal of that army? I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for that, Jimmy. Would one of the speakers like to respond to that? And then we've got a couple more questions in the chat. Any volunteers?
Yeah, I can start, and Nadim can elaborate. I mean, there's two parts of that question. There's, I think you were asking specifically about the role of the UN, which is positioned on the south of the border in Lebanon to kind of ensure that the border between Lebanon and occupied Palestine is respected. And then there's the question of the Lebanese army in general. And historically, the role of the army in Lebanon has been seen for a very long time as a neutral force, as whenever we'd have a political crisis, usually someone from the army is promoted to the role of president as a consensus force, and really it's just another facade. So you have had calls at the beginning of October, of the uprising, for people to call for some kind of a military coup or some kind of military junta to take over. As the uprising has progressed, and right now the army is playing a completely counter-revolutionary suppressive role. If I want to compare it at the beginning of October, when people would go out in the streets waving army flags, and you'd have videos circulating on social media of soldiers kind of crying because they're having to confront protesters. That does not exist now. The army is playing a completely suppressive role. They have been rolled out not only in a capacity, because Lebanon was already in a state of emergency due to the COVID. So the new law that was passed last week gave them even more powers, where they can now arrest anyone in their homes for any reason. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that should the army play a more political role, it would be in the favor of the uprising. And this is not to mention that the army itself is very co-opted. You have different sections of the army that have allegiances to different sectarian parties. So I think it would be a mistake to put any kind of hope in that direction. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Jade. Just to return to the chat comments, and comrades can put the questions in the chat if they'd rather do that. Let's see what we've got here. Well, there's a question here. Could the situation lead to the major powers taking greater involvement in the region, namely the US and Russia? And sort of connected is, are there any powers? I've lost it now. Sec. Is there any international power which does not support the national bourgeois in Lebanon? Anybody feel they can respond to that?
Sure. I mean, considering the first one, of course, there could be greater involvement in the region. And I'm actually, all my eyes are on Russia now. It's always people are talking about all the other ones, like France and the West specifically now, specifically with all the aid that's coming in after the explosion. But my eyes are on Russia. I think they're going to make some moves pretty soon that might be a bit interesting to watch. But yeah, I mean, of course, many powers are now going to exploit this crisis because it's coming to the edge of complete collapse. I mean, the state, at least some kind of state, whatever is left of it, is more or less on the verge of collapse economically, specifically, and COVID as well, and many other crises. So I'm sure many powers are going to try to exploit that kind of vacuum or space and try to direct it in certain ways. But there's no predicting. From my position, it's difficult to see how it's going to pan out. It's difficult to see what forces will ally with what local forces and so on. But as I said, given Hezbollah's presence, its hegemonic presence, I'm sure Russia might have something to do with the issue here. Is there any international powers that does not support? I mean, I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that question. But most international powers aren't really radical, so I don't think they're gonna come saving us. I think they have certain interests, and as they always do, and they're very hard to find the opposite. So that's my take on that. The other questions down. How united is the ruling class? I tried to answer that when I said in my beginning by saying that they are, in my opinion, they're fragmenting, they're kind of cracking. Not to say that they're not strong, not to say that they don't have their loyalists, they do, but they are cracking. And not on sectarian lines. It's not so much so on sectarian lines. Again, the sectarianism is usually, in that sense, is much more thin than it's deep. So they're not cracking on sectarian lines. They're cracking on power. You know, who takes over what, and who maintains his seat and who doesn't. And that's just the elite fraction kind of fight. And would working people be easy to split? That's the question. You know, that's the $1 million question under there. Is like, what will working people do when this crisis of the elite, in addition to the fact that we're building our own movements, how will we respond? It's very difficult to predict that, in my opinion. And as for the last question, the radical left, again, I think we touched upon that there's not much of a formation as such, but there are all these mini groups that are very radical, actually very surprisingly radical sometimes, but they're still small and they're still fragmented and they're still kind of working like ships in the night. Sometimes they come together and intersect, and sometimes they don't. But that's the situation we're in right now. Sorry that was a bit long, and I'm not sure if I was meant to answer every question, but I thought I should.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much, Nadim, for covering all those questions. That's very helpful. We've got Ed next.
Well, thank you, Pam. I mean, I was going to ask I do want to ask a few questions, but just before I do, on this question of the role of sort of Western powers and other capitalist powers in this situation, to me, it seems quite likely that, I mean, I agree with what Nadim just said, that the international powers are not going to come in and save Lebanon, but they want to use this terrible explosion catastrophe as a kind of shock doctrine. That's one of the reasons that Macron went there, that they want to go in and start putting money in return for things being further privatized, and the proceeds that they're investing in the country being siphoned off to Western capitalist countries. And so they are consciously making an intervention, and I think they're doing it out of fear and panic. And there are a number of reasons for the fear and panic. I mean, one is they don't want Iran to get any more leverage in Lebanon, and that could be an outcome depending upon how this goes. Another is because the whole situation in that part of the world is highly unstable at the moment. I noticed in the news just a couple of days ago that even in Israel, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting, calling for Netanyahu to resign. Netanyahu himself has described these demonstrations as leftist and anarchist, which gives you an indication of how the public mood is developing in Israel. And from the point of view of the West, all the traditional points of support that they have tried to establish in the Middle East are becoming very, very fragile, and they will be desperate to try and reassert control. And particularly, that's because in the immediate aftermath of this explosion, the main, as I've been reading the news, the main drive, the main initiative to start search, rescue, and rebuilding operations came not from any official organization of the state, but came from people spontaneously coming together, communities coming together. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you comrades who know the situation, but that's as I've read it, and that kind of somebody said that we have to provide services on the ground in order to counteract the existing sectarian divisions and sectarian interests. Well, the coming together of people in rescue operations and so on, that is already the beginning of providing those those grassroots community initiatives that build solidarity and break down sectarian barriers. So I think that both the ruling class in Lebanon and the ruling class in the Western powers, who are continuing to try and get an influence, are very worried about this situation. I mean, I hear everything that comrades have said, comrades who know much more about the situation on the ground, about how difficult it is for the left to regroup and assemble itself and create a coherent party of revolution, which would be what would be necessary, as one of the comrades so eloquently put it, to transform the situation from, I think you said something like from a revolutionary process, the beginning of a revolutionary process, to a revolution. But partly related to that is this question of, one comrade said that the CP, the Communist Party, did not win a single seat in the last election. Where are the votes that were going to the Communist Party? Where are they going? Are they disappearing altogether, or are they going somewhere else? And that these smaller mini groups, very small, radical, fragmented groups, do they stand in elections? Do they get anywhere? Do they, is there any possibility of them beginning to form a bloc together to stand in elections? Those are my questions. Thank you, comrades. Thank you for your very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. There's also somebody in the comments that said which radical left formations are there on the ground. So maybe someone, or maybe one of the speakers or somebody else would like to answer that. Are you trying to answer that question, Dave? Are you into something else? You're into something else, right? Can I throw that one back to those last bits back to the speakers then, please? Jade?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Yes, like what's happening on the ground, these what you've called these kind of spontaneous, which I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to trace back all of these movements back to 2015 and before is because they aren't very spontaneous. These kind of networks of support have existed, but in many ways they exist in an apolitical form. They still don't have a political character. They're very reactive. They're very humanitarian in nature. And then on top of that, I do want to add that, Lebanon, having gone through a close to 16-year civil war, there is, and rightfully so, this fear of direct confrontation, both from a political sense and from a material sense. There was a question about this falling back into a civil war. A civil war requires two sides to fight it, and right now you don't have those two sides. You have the ruling class, which after the civil war, most have been disarmed as part of the peace treaty, except for Hezbollah, which was through legislation given this role of resistance. I mean, a lot of people present Hezbollah as a kind of grassroots solidarity, kind of anti-imperialist force, but it's given legislative cover by the ruling class as part of their agreement of dividing the loot, essentially. And when Nadim talks about the fragmentation of the ruling class, he is more talking about the other parties that no longer have this form of dual power, of actual material power to suppress a revolution. They don't have it anymore, and they can't wield the army exclusively in that capacity. So what you have is this really strange situation where Hezbollah is coming to save the ruling class, and will essentially be able to take a greater piece of the pie for itself. And we talk about international intervention. It's worth mentioning there is already Russian presence in the port under humanitarian guise. And it's important to understand Iran's foreign policy as well in the region, who has been seeing their role as well as their partnership with China in developing the Middle East section of the Belt and Road initiative. So Iran's incursion into Syria and into Lebanon needs to be understood as part of that greater global economic move that's happening. And yeah, again, in terms of is any of the international community not with the ruling class? Because every part of the international community has a different part of the ruling class for them to essentially act as a part of or a piece of. The only maneuvers you're seeing from places like France is, again, to secure their own investments, but you don't have an alternative right now. So all of these movements are part of just what's happening internally, and I think it is too early to see how it's going to emerge.
Yeah, I'd also like to add, and thanks, Jade. I completely agree with what you said. And just to add to this as well is that, and a great question also, a lot of things to say to it. I'll just respond with the issue of international powers and Western intervention. Just as Jade was, just building on what Jade was saying, is that we really can't, we have to understand how these geopolitical forces and the circuits of capital that are working in this region, we have to factor in just what's going on. Like, look at how the US, for example, in relation to US imperialism, the US failed in Iraq, the US failed in Syria, the US failed in Lebanon, more or less. And so when now, after this Beirut explosion happened, and the elite, as Jade clarified in the sense of cracking, is that they no longer can maintain these material networks, the international forces now are, like, especially the West in that sense, backed mainly by the US, are just trying to score a certain victory in the landscape here, because the last few defeats they've suffered have been quite costly. So I would read their moves in that kind of, with those interests in mind. They trying to shore up and fortify the status quo, because they're seeing it crumble in a way and losing ground to Hezbollah slowly but surely. Concerning the spontaneity, and what Jade said was really good here, is that this kind of, like, there's been like this kind of wave on social media of all these volunteers and youth who go down and clean and help and share social, food and whatnot. And then there was this kind of almost a sudden emergence of like a new kind of identity almost, just in beginning to be formed. That's kind of combines anyone and everyone who's just not in the government or not in the ruling kind of, mainly the government. And I think it's dangerous, because what it does is it's kind of replacing a politics with this kind of humanitarian ethos / entrepreneurial individualism. You know, you go down as a person and you help out your friend, and we can all take care of ourselves. And it can really kind of become a slippery slope into a very almost neoliberal subject that becomes this like NGOization of things. And it's a bit dangerous, because if it's not taken into, if it's not, you know, captured or mobilized or influenced or directed by a genuine politics, it's not looking very good for us, honestly. We're going to end up with a very humanitarian, almost ethical response to our crises, which will not be able to deal with the genuine structural problems at hand. Last thing to say, is also something I forgot to mention, but is important in understanding the Lebanese and other protest movements in the region, is the extremely powerful impact of Gulf capital. Too often we look at imperial networks and how those networks affect the region, and of course they're true, but just as important is the insane and extremely high level of impact Gulf capital has in shaping and forming our local economies, our crises, the extent to which at any moment they can just threaten with capital flight, the extent to which they use you as a kind of financial hub to money launder and you know, evade taxes, is a very important thing. For example, and even historically, take Lebanon's banking system. People forget to mention that one of the reasons why the banking system became such a free market, in that sense, such a neoliberal version, is because in Iraq and Syria and in Egypt, banks are being nationalized. So many of the business elites would send their money to Lebanon to kind of hide it and allow it to, you know, escape from this kind of nationalization. And so as such, it's not just Western capital in that strict sense. It's also, it's more, that's why I would urge to see things through circuits of capital that are international in scope, but much of it comes from Gulf. And for example, Hariri was a big, you know, story here in the terms of bringing in neoliberalism, ushering in neoliberalism, can be seen as a direct extension of Gulf capital, because he came from the Gulf and more or less got all those resources from the Gulf. And that's a very important story that's always under the rug. And I think it's very important to shine on that a little bit. But that's all.
Thanks very much, Nadim. Right, I'm going to bring David Hemsen in now. Then we've just got one more speaker. If we don't get any more, I'm then going to ask Jade and Nadim if they just want to sum up briefly at the end. Yeah, I know, David. We David Hemsen in first, then it's you. Okay, David.
Okay, well, look, thanks so much, Nadim and Jade and others. You know, we've all been learning a lot, and in certain points, you know, there have been some corrections and some illuminations. I mean, it's a very great, it's really a good discussion. Can I make some difference with you, Nadim, on the question of corruption? In other words, that we are indifferent to whether a state is really corrupt, a little corrupt, or fighting to have some sort of national purpose. Now, I don't have a final situation. I mean, all capitalist states are corrupt to some extent or other, but the degrees of that are quite astonishing. You know, there are indices of this and so forth. Now, why is this of importance to us? Well, if you can take, you know, the situation in many countries, but let me just give you an illustration from South Africa. At one time, we had a national electricity corporate body, which used to get AAA ratings internationally. Now the debt is catastrophic, and there's hardly, electricity supplies, even during a recession, are problematic. I mean, the looting's phenomenal. And the possibility of economic growth with such catastrophic state services is very, very low. In other words, I don't think we can support that. We can't be indifferent to that. And more than that, the degradation of the state particularly in the former colonial countries, can have really ugly results. For instance, I don't know if anybody here knows that in Mozambique, a port has recently been taken over by a faction of ISIS. And the national army, that's the Mozambique army, has been driven out. And ISIS is now becoming triumphant. They're even talking about ISIS regrowing now in Africa and not in the Middle East. And that is because there's been so deep corruption in the Mozambican state that most of the state doesn't exist. It's billions have disappeared here, there, and everywhere. And actually, I mean, the state as armed bodies or disciplined armed bodies of men doesn't exist. They have to now pay mercenaries from Russia to come in and try and help. And those people are going to be cut to ribbons. So in other words, these are very dangerous situations. And I don't think we can be indifferent to the question of corruption, not in the case of the, you know, as a middle class concern, but in terms of fighting for national and democratic development in the countries in which we're in. Of course, we're internationalists, but we also have to have our roots somewhere. And actually to fight for the working class, not to be ripped off and so forth. Just one point about this is that generally people think, oh, well, the state's fine. If there's a bit of corruption, that's not a problem. But please understand this. There is no state corruption without extensive privatization. Now, it's not called privatization. I mean, there are no honest tenders going out to international, multinational companies to come and do electricity for South Africa. Far from that. What they are doing instead of that is that they're giving off contracts to their brothers, right? Now, these people are useless at doing this work. But so you then go to China or to somewhere else and you say, you know, we can get you a big deal in South Africa. So we split the profits 50-50. You do the job, I take the money. But of course, it's not quite as simple as that. So imagine that the degradation of the state like this is catastrophic for working people because it just means that you never can win. You've got to lose every single time you take up a struggle. And what made my blood pressure rise in relation to Lebanon was this, that I heard, you know, the billions that were being spoken of. And then the donors were saying, well, of course, we have to have some structure. We can't just give the money to the people. We've got to have a structure to take this money. Then I heard this professor at the Beirut University of Urban Planning saying already the land has been taken by sections of the elite. Now they've got the land, they're just waiting for the money. They're going to become catastrophically rich. This is going to be a devastating development for the Lebanese people. Not only will you have a corrupt elite, but you have a corrupt elite which has never had more money if they can get away with it. And France will be ready for that. Russia would be ready. Everybody is on board with this because they want this elite to continue as before. I think it has extraordinary damaging and dangerous political implications. And I certainly don't think that Marxists can be indifferent to the question of corruption, not because we are nice, legal petty bourgeois and we don't like to see it, but because of the results. The results are devastating for the colonials, you know, in a colonial state. And, you know, formidable countries like South Africa had a formidable economy. It's now reduced, you know, we're approaching ruin. And we can't be indifferent to that. That means hundreds of thousands of people to be dismissed and, you know, and the working class to be cut down to sizes in Zimbabwe, where at one time it was something like 40% of the population, and now it's about 3%. So that kind of ruin is not good for the working class. It's certainly not good for the revolution. So that's just one point. I think we stand corrected in a sense on, or asked to clarify the language when it comes to revolution or to a revolutionary situation, a revolutionary outcome, the development of revolutionary forces and the like. You know, I think our general approach, you know, I'm speaking maybe for others to come in, is that when we see people prepared to run against the bullets and to continue that day after day and to, you know, against all the odds, you know, we know that there's a revolutionary spirit in the land, which is very infectious. And that's what I hope to have learned more about the situation in Lebanon, possibly affecting elsewhere. That's why if there's a defeat in Lebanon, after all these high aspirations of the people, I can see that it's going to be cloudy days for Syria, which is, you know, bordering here and then, and maybe also in Iran. If there's some way in which the Lebanese people can advance and move on to taking power in some ways, and that's what people are talking about. I've heard interviews with people on the BBC. They say we have to have power, and it's extraordinary that you can hear that from a professor of urban studies or something like that. And maybe it's just language, but it's certainly an aspiration, because they realize that there's total degradation and total corruption among the people that have actually ruled them. And they say, this state is killing us. It has been killing us for decades. Now, that's the language, I think, of revolution. Whether it's going to succeed is something else we have to calibrate, but certainly the spirit is there. So the conclusion I would sort of try and pull together is that, you know, the Lebanese revolution cannot succeed on its own. I think you've pointed out all the facts are there. And the Hezbollah is a major issue, you know, as well. But if there are revolutionary movements that are arising in Iraq, Iran, and maybe in Egypt, but mainly, you know, those two, then I think the prospects in Lebanon are actually pretty good. You know, and we look forward to see those developments.
Thanks, David. I'm just going to bring Dave Buxton in now, because he's had his hand up for a while, and then we'll return to Nadim and Jade, and you can respond to that and make some closing comments if you like. Is that okay?
Thanks, Pam. Right. It's a very, very interesting meeting, very thought-provoking, and I've had this thought, whether it's strictly socialist or not, I'm not sure, but I'm going to say it anyway. And it sort of relates to, I think Nadim said about don't approach the question of sectarianism in a discursive way, but you have to address the practical needs of the people. So I was thinking, because of the issue of corruption, those docks need to be rebuilt. So I would say, if I was in the Lebanon, I'd be saying, the docks is a priority. We can't rebuild the docks ourselves. We need some country like China, which is got the Belt and Road program, that whoever gets it, the key issue is we can't have corruption. We have to have openness and transparency. And you'd make a demand like that an X percentage of the workers in that project, which is going to be a massive project, should be Lebanese workers on trade union rates with trade union rights. And you'd make that demand via the people of the Lebanon, and I think that would have a big echo, because, you know, the fact this has created havoc and the need for the port. So it's just an idea I had in terms of connecting with Lebanese workers, and then you tie in the question of trade union rights and trade union rates. And on the issue about left groups and how they relate to people, and I was thinking, we've talked a lot in our Black Lives Matters discussions online about the role of the Black Panther Party, and that's an alternative to the Hezbollah model. It's also practical, because there they had feeding programs for children, education programs for kids, health programs. So, and I think too many groups on the left don't address those practical needs of the people. And in a country like Lebanon, it's obviously absolutely necessary to have a revolutionary organization, because that's what the Black Panthers called themselves, revolutionary socialists. They address the practical needs of their people. But one of the key issues was education, because they looked at the history of America and the oppression of the Black people, and they had education programs. So translating that to the Lebanon, if there's no formal history, the socialists should do a socialist history of the Lebanon and the region. And I have to say, along the lines of the book that Roger Silverman wrote on Greece. Now, I didn't know a lot about Greece, And I read that book and I was utterly amazed by the complexities of how the West got involved, particularly during and after the Second World War, to stop the communists having influence and power post-war. So if the socialists had a party like, it doesn't have to be the same, I'm just saying that's a model, the Black Panthers, that took seriously the question of education and educating the people, then I could see that that would be a way that they could build their influence. And then thirdly, is the role of Iran. Now, and how to undercut the support for Hezbollah. You know, I'm talking about someone who lives in the West, has no inkling of how such groups and religious organizations have such a powerful impact on your society. But if you also did a socialist analysis of Iran's history and how there was a strong left there, and I think you, Nadim, said about how a lot of the left have all these illusions. Well, I agree with you. In Iran, a lot of the left, leading up to the revolution that ousted the Shah, a lot of the left was saying, oh yeah, we had great illusions in the Ayatollah as being some radical force, and it totally sort of disarmed it in a practical way, the left, in facing the threat in Iran when the revolutionary troops of the Ayatollah started repressing everyone. So if you had a socialist analysis of Iran, that's another way you could sort of strengthen the forces of the left. So I just wondered, Jade and Nadim, what comments you had on my thoughts on your situation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Dave. Right, it's 10 to 9. Would Nadim and Jade like a few minutes each to just respond to those last two contributions and make some closing remarks? I have noticed questions are still appearing in the chat, so if you could deal with those at all, that would be appreciated. I don't know who would like to go first.
Sure. I'll just
I
quickly
think you go first. Yeah, right. Thank you.
I'll try to be quick. Just in response to David, I mean, I just want to say, no one's saying that corruption is not a problem. No one's saying that it doesn't get in the way of working class. Of course it does. It's just an issue of analysis. How do we understand it as a phenomenon? And I'm just saying, I'm of the type who argues that corruption should be understood as a symptom, not as a cause. It's not, you know, if you look at the cause, if you want to see it in a cause-effect relation, although I don't like to do that because I prefer a more dialectical approach. But nonetheless, if we were, I would like to see corruption more as the effect or the symptom. I mean, I like to use the word symptom here to complicate the nature of cause and effect, but of much more structural conditions that are embedded. And those structural conditions have a history, a very particular history. If you want to know why a specific place is corrupt more than, I agree that there are degrees of corruption, but understand why is it heavier in one place and not another, and not only the extent of corruption, but the effects of corruption. It's extremely important to understand that corruption isn't just one thing. Look at China or Russia, for example. One could say that corruption soars through the roof, but the way in which that corruption is directed, the way in which state building uses that kind of rent-seeking behavior, has developmental aims, let's say in China or Russia, much more so than in Lebanon, where corruption has clientelistic aims. But the reason that's the case relates to the particular history we have, as we just mentioned today, all through the colonial history up until the local bourgeoisie and what they did and what alliances were formed and what kind of political economy was created. Is it a rentier economy, a productive economy? What role it plays in the geopolitical landscape? And when you put all that together, well, yeah, you get a certain color of corruption. But to say that, you know, corruption is the problem is much like those kind of neoliberals who in the post-Washington consensus argue that, oh, you know, yeah, we realize the market needs a good state and it needs some good laws and some basic kind of state, you know, that we admit that finally. And then whenever a crisis happens, they'll just say, it's because you guys, you know, you didn't apply our privatization, our liberalization well enough because you're too corrupt. So it very much steers in that direction, this kind of neoliberal understanding of development. That's just my take on it. So it's not that I disagree with the impact of corruption, but just how we understand it is important to steer away from, in my opinion, these kind of arguments that beg the question. As for other, Mr. Dave, I appreciate your thoughts. They're very welcome as to how to organize and how to move forward. As I said before, unions might be a good way forward. It's still very much in its nascent stages. So I don't know what else to say. Your comments on Iran are very much in place. In fact, yeah, it's one of the good lessons for the left, because they indeed did put too much trust in the clergy, and that, you know, didn't turn out so well. The difference in Lebanon, though, is that it's not so much a religious, you know, power that we're struggling with. These guys aren't religious by any real sense of the term, with the exception of Hezbollah aside. As I said, sectarianism here shouldn't be read as a kind of identity. It should be read as a material, colonial, capitalist formation. So only a very small minority are like these kind of die-hard loyalists who really believe in the identity itself as such, as some kind of essence. Most people, when they speak of sectarianism, they know that they're doing it from a very utilitarian lens, from a very, very materialist lens. I need to access a hospital to do that. I need to have good relations with this boss. This boss wants me to say XYZ, I will. It's much more, you know, cynical in a sense. So that's how I'd answer that, just to respond to these kind of comments. And as for the chat box, again, so here, is there evidence for the decline of religious belief amongst younger people? Once again, we are as religious as any other community out there. Really, it's not, I don't want to fall into this Orientalist trap where every time we look at the Middle East, we're somehow more religious. I mean, look at the US and how if by the same token, I could say the US are a bunch of evangelist Christians, you know, who are, have they lost their, it's not a helpful lens. If anything, the October if you want to rephrase that question, it would be, is there evidence that the youth has stopped becoming loyal to their, you know, sectarian parties? Yes, there is lots of evidence of that, as the October uprisings have demonstrated. Sorry, but that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Nadim. Sorry, Pab, did you want to come in? Yeah, I just wanted to build on that, just to reply, you know, going back to David, that's kind of why my first intervention, I wanted to focus on this concept of the state. The state in Lebanon cannot exist except the way it does right now, within capitalist relations, unless we're talking about a socialist state, which we are you know, right now nowhere close to that. You know, that is so. I mean, maybe I'd love to be proved wrong. You know, maybe tomorrow we wake up to a socialist Lebanon. But in terms of the way the state exists right now, this is the only way it can exist. And I think the reason why Nadim was pointing quite, you know, and I think rightfully so, to this concept of corruption is because there is a tendency in Lebanon within the uprising that talks about corruption without this concept of the sectarian system, not as a religious system, not as a social system, but as a material system where the ruling class, we call them zaims in Arabic, they're kind of the warlords, or the ruling people. They have been in power ever. You know, a lot of them came from landed gentry back under Ottoman times. We still talk about the Jumblats and the Erslans, which are the families that existed as landowners. They always already owned the capital. So there was no way for the Lebanese state as a capitalist state to develop in any other way as it has now. And that's why I think it's important for us, especially in Lebanon, as this debate happens in Lebanon, for us to lose this naivety that we can reform the state. It requires a fundamental socialist transformation where the means of production, and even though the in Lebanon is still on paper, you have a lot of public-owned companies. The port is publicly owned, the electricity is publicly owned. You still have a lot of these core things, but they're not. There's complete translucency between private and public because of the sectarian system. So that's why kind of I think Nadim is being very passionate about this. And then to add to what Nadim was saying about the materiality of sectarianism, most polls in Lebanon that question people about whether or not they want to get rid of the sectarian system come back, I don't want to say an overwhelming majority of people who are happy to move away from it, but there is a majority of people who want to move away from it. So when we talk about religion and sectarianism, it's not on a social or on a personal level. As Nadim just said, Lebanon's a country like any other. There isn't a kind of ingrained fundamentalism or an essence of this kind of religious struggle. It exists insofar as it allows this ruling class to demarcate what's mine and what's yours amongst each other, of course, not with the ruling class. So I just wanted to bring that in. So even when we talk about nationally owned things, we talk about them as if they are already privatized, as if they are already in the hands of the ruling class. And yes, it will be worse if, one of the IMF's key conditions is to privatize more of these things. They can be more outwardly, owned directly by these people. So I just wanted to talk about that a bit. So when we talk about sectarianism, it's these material relations. It's things as simple as your religion is still on your document. No matter how secular you are as a person, you are forced to go through these systems that are sectarian, that are religiously funded. The state funds its own religious institutions, which is a whole nother layer of corruption and you can't have a civil marriage in Lebanon. If I wanted to get married to someone else from a different religion, I can't do that in Lebanon. I need to travel to do it outside, and then the state will. So it's just so fundamentally ingrained. There's a quote kind of people say in Lebanon, kind of apologetics for being sectarian, which is a truism. They say, I'm not sectarian, but the system forces me to be sectarian and to act sectarian and to think upon sectarian lines. And it's because even if I'm not sectarian and I want to, make sure a family member has a spot in a hospital, I'm going to have to go to my sect's leader and beg for a hospital bed and or a job or medicine or anything like that, because they have built these clientelist networks. I think just an important clarification there. Dave, just to go back to you, nothing you said is wrong. It's just a question of who's going to do these things. We don't have these people yet to build this this dual power, even if it, and whatever we're having of it in a humanitarian sense is very apolitical, it's very timid, is not outspoken. Who will make the demand of the port construction being done by union workers, etc. That's what we're in the process of building, and that I hope we see kind of developing and evolving.
Thanks, Jade. That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I think we've had an extremely interesting and an extremely thorough discussion this evening. I've certainly learned a lot from listening to all you people, especially our witnesses on the ground, which is Jade and Nadim. So very, very big thank you to Jade and Nadim for coming along and joining us and sharing your experience, and also to David Hemsen for his excellent lead-off. We have meetings of the Workers' International Network every week at this time. If you're not on our mailing list to join in, please let us have your email address. We'd really like to invite Nadim and Jade along, wouldn't we? So the next meeting is next week at 7 o'clock. I don't know if we know what the topic is yet, but it will be on an international subject of for somewhere or other. Roger.
Yes, we will organise another very interesting meeting, I'm sure, next week. And I wanted to ask if anybody has any contacts in Belarus. Could you let us know? Because that's the next uprising. Let's get the word right, that we need to get a bit more information from. And I'd just like to repeat, Jade and Nadim,
sono I confini, rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, trionferà.